Welcome to another episode of History Now the Future, the show where we take a sharp look at some of the most pressing issues of today, using history as our guide and the future as our destination. My name is Cory Bradford. Now, when Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee for president about a month ago, we all knew that race would play an outsized role in this race. We also knew that at least some elements of racism would be inherent to some of the criticism of Kamala. Now, a very common narrative that you tend to hear from Republicans is their party isn't really all that racist. They tell us that the Democrats are the real racist folks. Just look at their history. Democrats were the party of the KKK, right? And even though that was over 60 years ago, things don't change much in the traditional minds of the grand old party. But in the last few weeks, it has become almost impossible to ignore the role that visceral racism plays in the Republican Party's overall strategy this year. The GOP's racism issues were already apparent months ago, from Donald Trump's insistence that Kamala Harris wasn't actually black, to Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance's racist and false rumors about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs in Ohio. But this past week, overt racism in the Republican Party went into maximum overdrive. First, prominent Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a man who brings so much shame to that great name, put on one of the most disgusting displays seen in Congress since Dennis Hastert was the Speaker of the House. If you know, you know. During what was supposed to be a hearing on the rise of hate crimes in America, Senator John Kennedy decided to turn it into a hearing on Hamas, as he constantly berated Maya Berry, the executive director of the Arab American Institute, with questions about whether or not she supported Hamas, the terrorist group behind the October 7th attack on Israel last year. Even though Berry very clearly told him that she didn't support that group, he continued to claim that she did. He also asked her whether or not she supported Hezbollah and Iran, and John Kennedy ended his attack by saying that she should, quote, hide her head in a bag. All of this coming from a prominent member of the party that claims racism really isn't their forte. No major Republicans have come out to condemn Kennedy for this tirade. In fact, most of them are just doubling down on the misinformation that he sprayed during this hearing. Constantly asking the director of an Arab American organization if she supports Hamas simply because she is Arab is like asking Senator John Kennedy if he supports the KKK or Stormfront or any number of white supremacy organizations simply because he's a white guy from the South. Although given this exchange, I'm sure he'd find some way to defend such organizations. Let's just be honest, he'd probably speak at their fundraisers. But if this wasn't enough to convince you that the GOP has a major issue with racism towards anyone who isn't white, then look no further than the recent scandal involving one of their most prominent black candidates in this year's election cycle. Mark Robinson, the current black lieutenant governor of North Carolina and the Republican nominee for governor in that crucial battleground state, has been known for saying a lot of controversial things, including many disparaging remarks about other African Americans. The GOP chose this wildly inexperienced man for lieutenant governor a few years ago solely because he's a black man that expresses extremist far-right views. One of those black guys that makes good old boys like Senator John Kennedy say, hey, I can't be racist. I like this one. On social media, Robinson has said that women who breastfeed in public are shameless attention hogs. He's called Barack Obama a, quote, worthless anti-American atheist. He's referred to his wife, Michelle Obama, as simply a man. Robinson once said online that I'm tired of blacks and Mexicans running around shouting about being proud of their race. Yet he defended the term white pride. But this past week, CNN reported that an online account connected to Mark Robinson posted several disgusting remarks in the comments section of a pornographic website. That same username was linked to other accounts belonging to Robinson, including accounts on Twitter, Pinterest, and YouTube. On the porn site Nude Africa, you can't make this shit up, Mark Robinson allegedly expressed support for slavery, said that he enjoys transgender pornography, even though he's gone on record saying that transgender people are abhorrent and shouldn't be allowed to use the bathroom of their choice, and he referred to himself as a black Nazi. He even stated that he would rather vote for Adolf Hitler over Barack Obama as president of the United States. This is the Republican nominee for governor of North Carolina saying these things. Just wanted to remind you of that. On the same day that CNN published their story, Politico published a separate story saying that Robinson's email was registered on Ashley Madison, a website designed for married people seeking to cheat on their spouses. The Washington Post also reported that the same username from Nude Africa had discussed having an extramarital affair with his wife's sister. And that post was deleted from the site as soon as the report linking the account to Robinson came out. Despite a growing number of individuals calling on him to drop out of the race, Mark Robinson is staying in, although the vast majority of his campaign staff has resigned, and his newest campaign manager is a Republican lobbyist who was once convicted of felony telecom fraud. And when it comes time for the GOP to distance itself from such nonsense, they simply won't do it. The Trump campaign has come out saying that it will not rescind its endorsement for Robinson, although Trump wouldn't even say the man's name and didn't even acknowledge the governor's race at all during a rally in Wilmington, North Carolina this past Saturday. Back in March, Trump actually referred to Robinson as Martin Luther King on steroids. What the fuck does that even mean? Now, I've said on multiple occasions that if the Republican Party would just focus on economic issues during this election cycle, they would probably win most of the competitive races this year. Because as James Carville said more than 30 years ago, it's the economy, stupid. That's the only thing that the working class and the middle class really care about. But instead of spending time talking about how you're going to fight inflation, how you're going to bring down high interest rates, how you're going to fix all of these high prices, you got Senator John Kennedy accusing all Arab women of being members of Hamas. Meanwhile, your one prominent black candidate for a governor's seat has been making statements supporting slavery and Adolf Hitler on porn sites for the past decade. Are you fucking serious? Even your most extreme members like Marjorie Taylor Greene know that the racism has gone too far. Greene called out Laura Loomer, another far-right extremist who's been spending a lot of time on Trump's jets recently, for racist remarks she made against Kamala Harris. Now, when MTG is starting to make sense, that's when you know nothing else is. And Democrats aren't doing this to Republicans. This is a problem of their own making, and I'm going to tell it to you just like Smokey the Bear would. GOP, only you can stop racist wildfires. All right, everybody, welcome to Trending Down. Now, on this segment, we usually take a look at, funnier and lighter stories going viral on social media and the internet. But this particular week, we didn't really write any stories for this segment because the only thing that's been going viral on social media over the course of the last week has been the stories surrounding Diddy and his recent arrest. So unless you've, literally been under a rock, you've probably seen something about rap mogul, rapper, and producer Sean Combs, also known as Puff Daddy, Puffy, P. Diddy, Diddy, Diddy Dirty Money, and Love, ironically enough. He has been arrested for a number of very serious charges, including sex trafficking, racketeering, drugging women. I believe there's some arson in there because allegedly he blew up Kid Cudi's car. I don't know if that's what that case is about, but that's a rumor that's been going around for a couple of years now. But yeah, very serious charges. Basically, Diddy is accused of running some type of sex crime enterprise or sex crime empire. I'm not really sure what it is. I haven't been paying a ton of attention to it because a lot of my fans and followers keep asking me, what do you have to say about what's going on with P. Diddy? And to be totally honest with you, I really don't care about this story at all. Like, I just don't give a shit. Now, I want to be clear here. I do care about the victims involved. Like, obviously, I'm not going to defend Diddy here. We all saw the video of what he did to Cassie, who's an R&B singer that he brutally beat, threw a vase at, knocked her out, dragged her down the hallway of a hotel. That video surfaced earlier this year. Now, late last year, Cassie actually filed a lawsuit against him, accusing him of all kinds of abuse. He settled that lawsuit within a day, but that opened up the floodgates for other people to come out and talk about the abuse that they suffered at Diddy's hands. And of course, that video of him abusing Cassie came out earlier this year. And after that video was released, there's pretty much no defense for Diddy. I mean, you can pretty much believe that he's capable of any heinous crime when you see him brutally assaulting a woman like that. And honestly, I sort of believe that a lot of this has to do with that video. You see, the statute of limitations had passed on any type of assault charges they could have filed against Diddy for attacking Cassie. Really, a lot of what's going on with this case is trying to punish him for that crime, a crime that they can't actually punish him for because of, legal barriers. But if it's a federal case and they're claiming that he was running this weird sex empire, obviously they must have enough evidence, because the federal government isn't going to go after you unless they have a lot of evidence. They have a very good conviction rate. And a lot of these rumors have been going around Hollywood and just on social media for years now. But, my problem with it is it seems like the legal justice system is being used for some odd purposes here. Like, for example, when they came out with the information that Diddy had 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lube in his house. It's like, was it really 1,000 bottles? Was it just like a few hundred and they exaggerated to make it seem like it was 1,000? Was it 500 bottles of lube and 500 bottles of baby oil? And why even report something like that? It really seems like that was an attempt to publicly humiliate Diddy. It seems like they're criminalizing Diddy's weird, overly sexual lifestyle to try to reinforce these very serious charges against him, even though they may not have enough definitive evidence to prove all those charges. Now, once again, like I said earlier, the only thing I really do care about when it comes to this story is the stories of the victims, right? People like Cassie who have actually experienced firsthand assault, sexual abuse, and different things like that at the hands of Diddy or anybody in Diddy's crew. Those are the things that I care about. I want their stories to come to light, and I want justice for those victims. But when it comes to these so-called freak-offs that were taking place at Diddy's house, these crazy sex parties that he was apparently throwing, I don't care what celebrities were there or what they did there. If it was consensual adults engaging in really freaky behavior that wasn't illegal, I don't care about that. That's something that very simple-minded people concern themselves with. Now, if there were minors there, to be fair, Diddy hasn't been credibly accused, I say credibly and legally accused, of having minors at these parties. That's not something that's included in all of these charges against him, even though he has been accused of that on social media. Legally, he's not facing charges related to anything dealing with minors. But if there were minors there, if there were people there being held against their will, if sexual assault was taking place, rape, things like that were taking place, if anything was happening to someone against their own agency, then that's a crime. That's something that needs to come to light, and Diddy needs to be punished and sent to prison for those acts that he was basically facilitating. But I don't care about celebrities having freaky parties because I've assumed that they've been doing that for centuries. There are so many important things going on this year. This election cycle is one of the most important we've seen in years. This presidential election will determine the balance of the Supreme Court for decades to come. It will determine the balance of power in our federal court system. A lot of these governors' races, like the one in North Carolina, these are crucial races that we should be paying attention to. And for the last week, we haven't been paying attention to it as much because we're all talking about which celebrities were at the Diddy freak-off. Again, if there were victims being abused there, I hope their stories come to light and I hope justice can be found for them. But honestly, there are way too many important things going on in the world today for me to give two shits about Diddy and his freaky parties. I just don't care about it. Take that. Seriously, take that story and get it away from me. So recently, there was a new movie that came out depicting the life and times of Ronald Reagan. It was called Reagan, and it stars Dennis Quaid as the former U.S. president. Now, a lot of my fans and followers have been asking me, have I seen this movie? What do I think about it? And to be honest, I have not seen the new Reagan movie. I'm not going to go see that in theaters, mainly because I already know a lot about Ronald Reagan. But also, from what I can tell from the trailer and everything that I've read about this movie, it doesn't seem like this is an actual biopic or some type of critical analysis of Ronald Reagan and his life and times in office. Instead, it seems like this is just a retroactive campaign commercial that is pushing a lot of the famous myths surrounding Ronald Reagan. And I also think that the timing of this film is very strategic as well. It's just a couple of months before the election, and I believe that conservatives behind this movie put this movie out at this time in order to try to bring up some type of nostalgia surrounding the Reagan age. Either way, what I wanted to do in this week's section of History Teaches Today is I wanted to break down 3 famous myths about Ronald Reagan, myths that I'm sure this movie reinforces, And I want to talk about the truth behind those myths. Are those myths real, or are they just myths? The first myth I want to talk about regarding President Ronald Reagan is the myth that Ronald Reagan was a very strong-minded, decisive leader. Like he was just one of the strongest US presidents that we've ever had. This myth mainly comes from three major events that took place very early in Ronald Reagan's first term. The first event took place on the actual day Ronald Reagan became president, on January 20th, 1981, Inauguration Day. Just hours after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, Iran released the American hostages that they had been holding there since the outbreak of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Now, the president right before Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, was actually negotiating the release of those hostages for months at that point. And I believe they reached a deal to release them in December, right before Ronald Reagan takes office. In fact, the morning of inauguration, Jimmy Carter was on the phone with Iran, still trying to negotiate the release as he was leaving office, like within the last few hours of him leaving office. But the hostages did not get released until a few hours, or I believe like an hour or so after Ronald Reagan becomes president. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that maybe the Iranians didn't understand America's political system and thought that they had to wait that long until Reagan became president to release those hostages. However, some evidence suggests that members of Ronald Reagan's team did some illegal back channeling to Iran, basically to convince them not to release those hostages until Ronald Reagan actually took office, which of course would be despicable. The fact that you would allow those hostages to stay there for another month or so just to make it seem like Ronald Reagan was the one responsible for the release, when actually Carter negotiated that release in the last several days of his presidency. Another event that made Ronald Reagan seem very strong at the very beginning was in March of 1981, Ronald Reagan survives an assassination attempt. John Hinckley Jr. shoots Ronald Reagan because he's trying to impress Jodie Foster, or he saw the movie Taxi Driver, something crazy like that happened. Ronald Reagan is shot in the chest during this assassination attempt. He has to go into emergency surgery. He's in the hospital for like 11 days, but when he comes out, he seems largely unscathed. Keep in mind, Ronald Reagan was 70 years old when this was taking place. So the likelihood of him even surviving that assassination attempt was pretty low. In reality, Ronald Reagan struggled to recover from that assassination attempt for several months after it took place, but you would never know that from his public appearances. Kind of similar to like FDR, when nobody knew he was actually in a wheelchair. Ronald Reagan's public appearances during that period were heavily staged and heavily crafted to make it seem like he was like invincible, like he was just some superhero that could recover from such a shooting so quickly, when in actuality he struggled with that for months afterwards. And the third event that took place, there was a major strike among air traffic controllers in 1981. Air traffic controllers work for the FAA, and they are federal employees, and technically by law they cannot go on strike. So when the strike started, Ronald Reagan was pretty clear. He said, you got 48 hours to come back to work, or all of you will be fired and replaced. And he did that. Several of them did come back to work, but a lot of them didn't, and he fired all of them, replaced them, and there was no way for them to get their jobs back. And this was an example of Ronald Reagan kind of showing that he's going to be a strong-minded conservative that won't bend to the will of unions and workers' rights. And these three events, which all take place in 1981, set Reagan up for the rest of his administration. From that point forward, he is seen as this strong conservative president. However, Ronald Reagan took a very hands-off approach to the presidency. I mean, this man was in his 70s the entire time he was in office. He was well known for nodding off during meetings. He took very short work days, would always be done with work by like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Ronald Reagan's image was perfectly curated, right? Like, he was a former actor. He was able to exude this sort of personality and this charisma. He had riz, is what Generation Alpha would say about him. And that is what made it seem like he was such a strong president, when in actuality, he was very hands-off and had very little to do with the day-to-day functions of government. The second big myth about Ronald Reagan deals with the economy. The idea that Reaganomics was good for the economy. The idea that Ronald Reagan built a strong economy. This could not be further from the truth. The reality is, what Reaganomics was essentially cutting taxes for the rich. Now, he also cut taxes for the middle class, but he mainly cut taxes for corporations and the very wealthy. And He decreased spending, but mainly only when it came to social programs, programs that benefited the welfare of regular Americans. He actually increased military spending by quite a bit. I think he tripled the military budget during his time in office. Because you're tripling the military budget while simultaneously just making small cuts when it comes to social welfare projects, really this resulted in a huge budget deficit as well as a huge increase to our national debt. Also, during that time period, Social Security taxes tripled. And Ronald Reagan was a huge defender of Social Security, which is actually a good thing. But because Social Security taxes went up so high during the 1980s, it really offset any type of gains that the average American would have saw from seeing their income taxes decrease. Poverty increased greatly during the 1980s. The national debt increased greatly, as I've already stated. But even by the early 1990s, we saw major recessions, mainly stemming from Reaganomics and those economic policies. In fact, the economic inequality that was fostered during the Reagan age is still a problem in the United States of America today. Reaganomics basically just allowed the rich to get richer, the poor to get poorer, and the middle class to shrink considerably. And the third major myth regarding Ronald Reagan is the idea that Ronald Reagan destroyed the Soviet Union, that he was somehow responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. In actuality, the main guy who destroyed the Soviet Union was one of its own leaders, Mikhail Gorbachev. When Gorbachev comes into power in the mid-1980s, he starts a series of policies that basically allow the satellite states of the Soviet Union to question a lot of the Soviet era policies, but more importantly, it allowed them to question their inclusion in such a union in the first place. All Ronald Reagan did during that time period was greatly increase our military budget, which you can argue started an arms race with Soviet Union that helped bankrupt them, but they were already going bankrupt for a lot of different reasons prior to Reagan's time in office. Besides that, Ronald Reagan just engaged in really harsh rhetoric towards the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire. Ronald Reagan was very famously anti-Soviet Union and anti-communist. And his rhetoric was so strong that it made it seem like he was taking these harsh actions towards the Soviet Union, when in actuality, he wasn't really doing much on the foreign policy stage against Soviet Union other than throwing harsh rhetoric their way. It was the actions of Mikhail Gorbachev that really led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, along with their own economic internal struggles. So again, I don't know if these myths are propped up in that movie, but I can imagine they are based off of the trailer. And I think it's very important to take a look at all presidents in the full context of what they've done, right? I don't necessarily share the same amount of hatred for Ronald Reagan that a lot of people on the left do. I don't think he was the worst president we've ever had, but I do think when it comes to the economy, his failures with the AIDS crisis, his failures with civil rights, I think there were a lot of blind spots in the Reagan administration. And I do think that a lot of the myths that continue to live on about Ronald Reagan are just that. They're myths. And we need to start looking at Ronald Reagan's time in office in the proper context if we're going to fix some of the problems that still stem from that administration. International news stories usually get swept under the rug here in the US because of the self-inflicted chaos within our own borders. So here on History Now the Future, we try to bring you some quick updates from around the world in 90 seconds. First up, Israel has stepped up its bombing campaign against the terror group Hezbollah in Lebanon, leading to a death toll of 558 people, according to Lebanon's public health ministry. Israel claims its objective here is to push Hezbollah away from Israel's northern border. Fighting between Hezbollah and Israel has escalated since the start of the recent Israel-Hamas war. Now, officials here in the United States have said that they have warned Israel against launching a full-scale war in Lebanon, claiming that such a war would be against Israel's best interests. However, given the billions of dollars worth of weapons the U.S. has given Israel in the past year, well, it's kind of hard to give your kid a Mustang and then tell them don't drive too fast in it. Probably should have thought that one out a bit more. Meanwhile, Ukraine is reporting that it used hand-to-hand combat to drive Russian forces out of a large processing plant in northeast Ukraine that had been occupied by the Russians for 4 months. And the West African nation of Burkina Faso claims its military junta, with some foreign assistance, thwarted an attempt to destabilize the country. The junta seized power in Burkina Faso back in 2022 after growing concerns that its democratically elected government couldn't protect citizens from terror groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But the junta hasn't been very successful at protecting from these groups either, and evidence of this possible coup that the junta claims it stopped has not been independently verified. This has been Around the World in 90 Seconds. All right, everybody, I want to thank you for watching this week's episode of History Now, the Future. This week on our Thursday interview episode, I'm going to be talking to a good friend of mine. His name is Jake Trumper. He is a history content creator on TikTok. And this week, we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories. We're going to be debunking some conspiracy theories, talking about the possible truth behind others, and we're going to talk about how conspiracy theories shape pop culture here in the United States. Don't miss that interview. It was a really fun one to do. Also, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the page so you never miss an episode. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you all next time.